What is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs. Victory, despite all terrors. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival.
Okay, hi guys, and welcome to the show. Today, a re-review of a watch I purchased a year ago now, back in 2000, the summer of 2017. Time has literally flown, forgive the pun, but I wanted to discuss why this is the greatest Omega watch I've ever owned. You guys know I've owned countless Seamasters, many Speedmasters. Omega is a brand extremely close to my heart because it was among the first of my luxury watches. It really made me fall in love with Swiss watches and the story behind watches as well, which is such an important aspect, especially for me. Why has this watch stayed when so many have come and gone? And I think once we delve into the fascinating story about principally their three most important watches during World War II, pilot watches that is, I think it will become quite apparent why this is such an important watch. Now, of course, I'll quickly do wristwatch check before I get into it. You couldn't get more polar opposite. Well, vintage inspired, but quartz, mecha quartz based, the Dan Henry I recently reviewed, and yes, I went for the Panda in the end. Absolutely love it. Yeah, over the moon with this piece. Anyway, so throughout the war, Omega delivered more than 110,000 pilot, navigators and field watches to the British Ministry of Defence, making it the biggest suppliers of Swiss watches, with more than 50%, while the rest being shared by other brands. Apart from the British, Omega supplied watches to either the USA, France and even Greece, and the expertise they gathered during the war was instrumental in leading to the launch, most notably, of the Seamaster collection just after the war in 1948. So great was Omega's contribution to the Allied forces that Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery actually personally visited the watch factory in Switzerland after the war. So the first of the trinity of Omega pilot watches was actually the watch that got me into this era of Omega and was featured in the Christopher Nolan Dunkirk movie, worn by Tom Hardy, of course. And this is the CK2192. And in fact, it was specially sourced specifically for the movie, completely period correct for the Battle of Dunkirk, and ultimately the evacuation of Dunkirk. I absolutely adored the movie. I thought it was a wonderful bit of watch casting. It was great to see, and of course hugely important because the movie demonstrated how critical mechanical timepieces were. We often take it for granted, especially in the modern age we live in today, how dependent pilots were on these tools, and these really were tools. And I know it's a bit of a cliche we band about when describing watches, but perfectly captured. Time itself is integral to not only the plot but the narrative of Nolan's best work, in my opinion. If you haven't seen Dunkirk, I urge you to go and see it. The CK2129 had a 15 jewel caliber 23-4 SC manual wind movement, and interestingly, it was the first Omega movement with the central seconds hand, and I think about 2,000 of these were supplied to the Royal Air Force. Now, I'm not entirely sure, but I think the case was entirely stainless steel, 33 millimeters in diameter. It also featured, like all the watches we're looking at today, a domed plexiglass crystal. This watch had a rotating bezel. This is what's called the Weems bezel, and is universally regarded as one of the all-time classic features found in early pilots' watches, and was invented by Professor Philip Van Horn Weems, a man who arguably contributed more to the advancement of air navigation than anyone else in the, especially the interwar period. Anyway, that's a whole other story. So the CK2129 was made to be as legible as possible. The rotating bezel enables intervals to be timed, utilized perfectly in the movie by Tom Hardy's character. There's a second crown that actually locks the bezel, so there's no risk of it being accidentally moved. Very much like the later 1950s iconic Airman, although that was obviously for a second time zone. This had 60-minute markings, which transforms a basic time-only watch into a rudimentary chronograph. It's great because it's a very reliable way of timing. We all know how fragile chronographs could be during this era. The less complicated a watch is, the less chance of things going wrong. So it was perfectly suited for this situation. So in 1940, Omega then introduced the second of the trio, the CK2292, which is of course the watch I have. This has also been nicknamed the Spitfire watch, which we'll talk about in just a moment. The early ones had a nickel case and was replaced not much later with a soft alloy featuring a stainless steel snapback. Inside we had the legendary 30T2 movement, which is basically the pinnacle of years of research by Omega in the 30s. This started production in 1939 and lasted all the way into 1963. And there were several iterations. The 30T2 was later known as the 2600 and the 2800 movements. The 30T2 SC version, in this case, had a central seconds hand. This is a 16 joule movement that has a power reserve of 44 hours and operates at 1800 vibrations an hour. This movement was perfectly suited for a pilot as it had a high degree of magnetic resistance, and this was provided by a special alloy used in this balance spring, because obviously pilots, especially in the cockpit, there were a lot of magnetic fields produced by the equipment. The 30T2 was not chronometer certified, but did receive special regulation on request of the British government. These were famed for being extremely accurate. Now, these watches all had satin brushed cases and a non-signed crown, and measured approximately 33 millimeters in diameter, and depending on the case variation, just a smidgen under 10 millimeters in height, with a 40 millimeter lug to lug and an 80 millimeter lug width. Of course, they are very small by today's standards, especially when you compare it to what the enemy was wearing, the giant 55 millimeter Fliegers. Omega supplied about 3,000 of these to the RAF. The design in all the versions for the most part was very similar, only with some slight variation in the lettering styles and the case shapes. And the RAF specifically requested a white dial with clear Arabic numerals. This was intended for nighttime bombing, along with a rail track and just 3 hands. But what is rather remarkable is the elegant choice of hands Omega went with these very classic blued poire or pear-shaped hands, which you don't immediately associate with military watches. However, I must say at a glance, it is easy to distinguish minutes from hours. So at the end of the day, it was actually practical, but a stark contrast from the extremely form and function, no nonsense Fliegers. A lot of these watches have been engraved on the case back, either marked HS8 for the Royal Navy and Air Fleet arm, or 6B159 for RAF. The soft alloy case version was made out of duralumin, which is basically a mix of aluminium, copper and magnesium. This was referred to as the UK2292. And then finally the last version was in 1943, entirely stainless steel. Interestingly, the only watch out of the watches we're discussing today that is officially listed on the Omega website, which brings up another point as to why a watch worn during such an important world-changing event is not mentioned as much or marketed like the iconic Moon watch, or of course the James Bond watches. The 2292 was dubbed the Spitfire watch, but actually it was designed specifically for navigators and bombers rather than the fighter pilots of the Battle of Britain. The 2292 would have just started arriving in 1940. These at the time would have not been automatically issued to Spitfire pilots for the simple reason that the Spitfire was a short-range, fine-weather day interceptor equipped with HF radio to allow to be directed from the ground. The Spitfire was equipped with the standard Smith's 8-day clock. They'd be able to see it at a glance rather than a watch that would have been under several layers of clothing, especially because the low temperatures in an unheated cockpit. So in other words, I'm sure that there were one or two Spitfire pilots that would have flown with this particular model, but more accurately and more commonly it would have been worn by bomber navigators, flight crew and pilots. The last watch of the trio is what superseded the 2292, and that is probably the most famous out of all of them, the CK2294. This was introduced at the end of the World War II, and it was radically different in design because it had the black dial with the numerals this time inverted in white, a subdial for the seconds at 6 o'clock, and luminescent paint on the hands and the numerals. This would have been presumably radioactive radium paint. But what made this particular watch so special is that as fighting moved towards the Pacific Ocean, waterproofing became very, very high priority. The watch had a good water resistance achieved by adding a screw-down case back, and the Ministry of Defense requested that WW2 was to be engraved on the case back. This stood for waterproof wristwatch. The CK2444 was known for its incredible water resistance to 30 meters. Now, I know that doesn't seem like a lot these days, but compared to the previous two watches with their snapbacks, it was a vast improvement. And this watch is particularly important because it was a massive influence on the design of the very first Seamasters. In the CK2444, we had the same manual wind movement as in my watch. Obviously, Omega, the 30T2 caliber, was already proving hugely reliable. This watch also famously had so-called broad arrow emblem below the Omega logo on the dial that marked the watch as Ministry of Defense property. The CK2444 was a smidgen larger at 35 millimeters. So back to my little darling here. Well, it's proved an absolute keeper. It has a magic to it that you just can't replicate with faux patina or a reissue or 1,000 special editions. In fact, it being only one of 3,000 and so many being lost, it's a limited edition in its own right. So what are the positives? Well, undoubtedly it has real historicity, real military provenance. And unlike the million Speedmaster and Seamaster special editions, don't get me wrong, I will always love them, this was actually worn by a pilot in World War II. Good luck trying to find a Speedmaster that actually went to space, you know. But look, not to diminish Omega's remarkable achievement with space exploration, but let's be honest, this was worn during a time that was a really trying moment for the world. If there had been a different outcome, it would have been a very different flag flying on the moon. So let's not forget that. This watch evokes feelings that no other really has done before, and it's wonderful to remember the sacrifices of the brave men and women of that period that I honestly think are too easily forgotten these days. And also being British, of course, I have a special connection to this watch, especially as I have many family members that served and fought during the war. So to have that history on your wrist is truly magical, and it just feels more special to me than any other Seamaster that I've owned. Also for me, its scale and size is just utter perfection. This is my sweet spot. Everybody has their sweet spot, and of course it could be totally too minute, and some people just don't even like patinaed watches to this extent, but it works on my wrist perfectly well. It's also extremely light, weighing only 38 grams. The watch actually came on this Phoenix strap, which is, if you know your history of the NATO strap, they actually produced the very first NATO strap. Now, I know this is complete anachronism to wear it on this, as NATO straps came out much, much later, but to have a British made mil spec from the makers of the very first NATO straps in actually the Admiralty Grey, which is what the first NATO strap came in, I think it just works wonderfully. It also secures the watch, although it does have soldered spring bars. I also love the 30 T2 movement. It's unequivocally one of the most important calibers, and arguably maybe made during Omega's peak of in-house real watchmaking. I do only wear this, ironically, as a kind of dress watch, mainly because of those absolutely gorgeous blued hands, and as a conversation piece. I was a little bit concerned about the way that tropicalization, I guess you could say, of the dial, because it indicates water damage, but I opened it up and it's absolutely fine. It has been serviced. The way the numerals have kind of almost like blotted paper, have faded, and it's utterly unique. I even considered buying one in more pristine condition, but it just doesn't have the soul, the magic of this. I like it like this. It has an utterly beguiling eggshell texture, distinctive and very alluring, the stories this watch could tell. So let's talk a little bit about the negatives. Well, obviously it's very fragile. Its Achilles heel really is the fact that the 30 T2 is not hackable, which is quite surprising considering the Germans had already made that an absolute must in their Fliegers. But these were more intended for reliability. Also, the soldered spring bars make it a little bit of an annoyance to change the straps. Originally, this would have come on a leather strap that would have had a folded section that went through the lugs, and then you fold it down. Now, of course, I can still buy those, but you're just going to be limited to your strap choice. But there's one last discovery about this watch that when I bought it, I was a little bit concerned, and I thought it was going to be a negative, but actually has become probably one of its most endearing qualities. The CK2292 never really had the glamour of the later watches, and for the simple reason that it was rather rudimentary, 33 millimeters, and it didn't really appeal to modern sensibilities. My small wrists excluded, of course. But in 1956, for civilian and further military use in the post-war period, Dennison, who are one of the largest manufacturers of high-grade watch cases in Europe, actually recased a lot of these. Dennison actually made this particular case specifically for this watch, entirely stainless steel and a high polish. Dennison have a very special relationship with Omega and were the perfect choice. They're a British company, and in fact it even says made in England on the case back. Subsequently collaborated with Omega on some of their early automatics, and most of their production was contracted by watch companies such as Rolex, Omega, Longines for the British market. At the time, Dennison not only worked closely with the Swiss watch brands, but was also a shareholder in Omega itself. While it's somewhat sad not to see the original military markings, it's great to have those made in England words inside the case back. In some strange way, it makes it even more personal to me, knowing that the case was manufactured and made in England. The country of my birth, of course. And not to mention Dennison having such an illustrious history of making watches for the British military before the war, as well as many steel components during the war effort. In fact, Arthur Dennison himself served as a pilot for the RAF during the war. So is it any wonder that I love this watch? The story associated to it, its authenticity, its completely unique look. I know I flip a lot of watches, but finally, after a year, I have an Omega that it's not going anywhere. To have something of that period in such a pivotal moment in world history that has elements that connect it to my birthplace, you're just not going to find anything else like it out there. In terms of performance, quite interestingly, it runs remarkably well. It does have some positional variation. I've noticed after I give it a wind, putting it on the bedstand, its accuracy is around plus 15-20 seconds a day. Not the best in the world, but you know, I'm willing to forgive it. It's earned its respect in its old age, but still has so much life to give. However, giving it that little wind every day, that very satisfying kind of resistance you feel, it's unmistakably has its own character. The CK2292 in particular, I think is vastly underrated and slightly forgotten about, especially compared to its more now famous forebearer and successor. And astonishing to think I only paid $900 for this bewitching masterpiece of sublime beauty. When was that? A year ago now. So yeah, if you can't tell, I absolutely adore this watch, and I intend to own it until I join those Spitfires in the sky. And much like the Spitfire itself, that it's become synonymous with, it's elegant, but yet gets the job done. It might be dwarfed by the bold efficiency of its German counterpart, but at the end of the day, this one's still here and ticking along nicely. So guys, I'm going to leave it there. Please do let me know your thoughts, queries, comments, opinions, all the rest of it down below. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it and found it useful. And as always guys, I will catch you in the next one. Okay, ciao.
This is a public service reminder for the good Gentry. Please follow us on Instagram, join the Facebook UGWC group, and click on the bell to keep notified of new videos. Don't forget to keep it positive, keep it Gentry, onwards and upwards. Thank you.